Share my screen for everyone. Perfect. Step one done. Now I will share my screen. Sharing. Is everyone able to see my screen so far?
There it is. I
Okay,
see
I'm
it.
opening it up to the actual PowerPoint. Is the PowerPoint slides the big screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, Laura, I'm going to pass it off to you to start our webinar.
Excellent. Thank you all for, like, as Patricia said, hanging in there. My name is Laura Clem. Stargirk and I are co-founders of the Friends of North Point, partner group of the Lakeshore Natural Resource Partnership. For more information, check out lnrp.org. I am thrilled to introduce Judy Cardin, a bumblebee expert and educator with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Community Science Program, Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade. Judy is retired from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, where she was a bureau director. Judy is also the administrator of the Facebook page Wisconsin/Midwest Bumblebee Observers, which I highly recommend if you're on Facebook. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you very much. I am so sorry for the technical difficulties, and I'm so glad to be here. So if we could switch slides. Well, you already heard all about me, but I'll just quickly tell you, when I retired, my story on how I came to love bumblebees is that I was looking for something to do that would contribute to the environment. And I wasn't sure what that was. So I started volunteering at the UW Arboretum. And I got out of my car one day next to a patch of bearded fox tongue and a huge bumblebee queen. Queens are about, at least 2 to 3 times the size of the workers that you normally see in your garden. And this particular bee was a black and gold bumblebee, which is the largest bumblebee in Wisconsin. So she was a presence. She came flying right at me, and she did this kind of back and forth in front of my face. She was checking me out, so I was checking her out. And it was an absolute epiphany for me because it just, she told me, this is where you want to be for the rest of your retirement. Because I realized when I looked at her that all these years of gardening and looking at bumblebees, I hadn't realized that there's all these different species of bumblebees. There's not just this yellow and black bumblebee, there's all kinds of bumblebees. So I just made it my mission at that point to learn more about them, to learn how to help them, and to share that information. So we can flip to the next screen. We're going to talk today about overall Wisconsin bees, why they need our help, and then we're going to look for a little bit at native solitary bees because there's hundreds of species of solitary bees in Wisconsin. And then we're going to focus in on the bumblebees. Next slide. Next slide.
There we go.
Okay. So if you have questions, that's my darling granddaughter, and she had questions about that flower. But if you have any questions, remember to just type them in chat as we go, and we'll stop about halfway through, and Patricia and Laura will read those questions off, and I will answer them. So next slide. So we have about 500 species of bees in Wisconsin. This kind of gives you an idea of some of the genuses, those large groups that the bees fit into. 85% of the bees are solitary bees. The female lives on her own in a nest, raises the young on her own in a nest. Some of these bees are so tiny, you might not even know you're looking at a bee if you see one on your flower. 30% of them nest in stems and cavities, and 70% dig holes in the ground. The rest of the bee population, the rest of the 15% of bees in Wisconsin are social bees, the bumblebees and the honeybees. Next slide. We're only going to briefly talk about the honeybee, and that's just to acknowledge that the reason that it's in the United States is to use as agricultural livestock. It's for me, they make honey that we all love. They pollinate certain crops and are actually moved around to do that pollination. But when we're talking about saving the bees, we're not talking about saving honeybees. Honeybees actually compete for natural resources with the native bees, and they also spread disease to native bees. So if you're going to save the bees and help the bees, focus on helping the native bees. Don't start a honeybee hive in your backyard. Next slide. So native bees and the rusty patch bumblebee in particular, which is an endangered species, need our help. Next slide. About 50% of Midwestern native bee species have disappeared from their historic ranges in the last century. Those ranges for those bees are narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. And in a second, we'll look at what that means for the rusty patch bumblebee. There are 4 bumblebee species that have declined 96% in the last 20 years. And there are 3 bumblebee species that may already be extinct. 25% of our bumblebee species are in danger of extinction. Next slide. So this is the rusty patch bumblebee range. And if you look at that light green area that covers almost all of the northeastern United States, that is the former range of the rusty patch bumblebee. It has declined by nearly 90% and was declared an endangered species by the federal government in 2017. Where the rusty patch is right now is, if you look at those little red dots surrounded by yellow, that's the remaining population of the rusty patch bumblebee. And if you look at where those red dots are clustered, Wisconsin is right in the middle of the cluster of the few remaining rusty patch bumblebees that are still alive in the United States. So we bear a special responsibility in Wisconsin to try to support the rusty patched. Next. So these are the bumblebees that live in Wisconsin. I think if you click to the next slide, it'll give us some circles on here. There we go. Keep clicking, keep clicking, and keep clicking. So all of those circled bees are in some state of threat in Wisconsin. So if you look at, we've got 20 species, you're looking at about half of the species are in danger in Wisconsin right now and need our help. Next. So what has caused the population decline? Habitat loss. If you think about where things were a couple hundred years ago versus where they are now, instead of prairies that's where a lot of bumblebees lived their lives, we now have farmland. We have cities, we have residential development, we have business development. And in doing all of that development, we've taken the habitat away from the bumblebees and a lot of native wildlife. Pesticide use has been a serious problem for a lot of pollinators, but including the bumblebees. Disease, climate change, and then intensive agriculture that goes on that has really disturbed the habitat of the bumblebee. Next. So what do they need from us? Well, what do we have control over? We have control over our yards. And there are a lot of residential yards in the United States and in Wisconsin. So what we can do is we can control what we do in our yard to support native bees. So we want to treat our yards as natural ecosystems. And for some people, you've already started on that journey and you're planting natives. For some people, you're probably thinking, well, what is it that I can do to help in my own yard? So the key things are you need to provide diverse native plants that have nectar and pollen flowers that are going to bloom all the way from April through October. And then you have natural habitat that supports nests and hibernation. And we'll look at examples of this and what it means. But it means getting away from that kind of cultural belief that we have to have these beautiful, perfect lawns, the turf lawn that is evenly mowed and never higher than 3 inches, and this very tidy little garden that never looks like something you'd see in nature. What we need to get back to is what is a natural ecosystem and how can we do that in our own yard? And then very important, pesticide free, avoiding all pesticides, which includes herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and rodenticides. Next. Let's take a look first at solitary bees. There's the ground nesting bees and the stem nesting bees. Next. Here's a publication that you can look at yourself that's available online, the Wisconsin Bee Identification Guide that comes from the UW Extension. And it breaks, there's hundreds of species of bees. What this breaks the bees down into, the solitary bees, are the sort of the genuses, the largest groups of bees. So this just gives you an idea of what's going on in your garden right now that you might not even know about. When I started looking for these bees, I had no idea. I have every single one of these species in my yard, and I wouldn't have known that 5 years ago. Next. So stem nesting bees, that adorable little bee on the sneezeweed there, one of my favorite bees, is a leafcutter bee. And a leafcutter bee, along with several other species that we'll look at, is a stem nesting bee. And so what that little leafcutter bee, for instance, does is she goes to my rose bushes and she cuts little semicircles out of my rose leaves, curls those up in a little furl, and carries them under her abdomen back to a stem and lines her nest with it. So it's one of those examples where if you have a good, healthy ecosystem, you're going to have holes in the leaves in your plants, and that's a good thing. That means that there's a give and take going on in your garden the way it should be. So what else do you want to do for stem nesting bees? You want to have pithy and hollow stem plants, and you want them to range from 1/8 to 5/16 of an inch in the diameter. Next. Next. All right, so here, I think we need to go back one. Here are some of the common stem nesting bees and their nests. So those leafcutter bees that I just looked at, that we're just talking about, that's the very first one there. And I won't go through each one of it, but it gives you an example. Each one of these bees does something different. It uses some material to line its nest or plug its nest in order to raise its young. So some of them need resinous materials, so the resin bees do. That's how they plug their nests. Some of them need mud. Some of them need water. Some of them need leaves in the case of the leafcutter bee. So it's a matter of, if you have a natural garden, you're going to be providing those materials. If you don't spend a lot of time doing cleanup and tidying, you're going to be providing material for these bees. Next. So let's talk about what you can do in your yard to provide stem nesting bee habitat. Next. This list was compiled by experts who watched some native plants to see what plants are actually being used by stem nesting bees for nesting and for hibernation. They use them for both. So I'm not going to go through that whole list, but it'll be available online, as Patricia said, if you want to take a look at this listing, to give you an idea of what you can plant in your yard that's going to provide good habitat for stem nesting bees. And if you look at a lot of those flowers, it's also providing great pollinator flowers. Next. And this talks about then, not only do you want to provide the stems, you want to provide the materials, and gives a little walkthrough of what's actually happening. So you want to provide those hollow and pithy stems from flowers and grasses. You can cut them in spring. What I do, and we'll look at a little diagram that helps you understand this, is I let my stems stand with the seeds on them at the end of the season. And I have birds feeding on seeds all winter long in my yard. When the bees start using them is the following spring. So what I'll do is those stems that are still left standing in my garden, I'll cut those off to varying lengths of 8 inches high to 24 inches high. In the spring then is when the bees are going to start using that for nesting. So when you hear people say, well, when in spring is it safe to do your cleanup and is it safe to get rid of the stems? It's not safe. That is exactly in springtime and into summertime is exactly when the bees are using those for their nests. Then what happens is later in the season, those same stems get used for hibernation by native bees. So you don't want to cut those stems down at all the first year, and you don't want to cut them down the second year because you still have bees hibernating in them in the spring, and you also have some of them getting reused for nesting. So my answer to the question is, when is it safe to cut down all of the stems and tidy up my garden is natural is beautiful. Don't cut the stems in your garden ever. What'll happen is that they decompose naturally and end up making your soil much richer, through natural decomposition. Next. And this is a little guide that walks through what I just said, that you want to leave your stems up. They get fully used year 1 and year 2, and they even get used into year 3. And by year 3, they're starting to decompose on their own anyway. So natural is beautiful. Next. So the ground nesting bees, there's a lot of species of ground nesting bees. Some of the bigger groupings that dig their holes in the ground are cellophane bees, mining bees, squash bees, longhorn bees, and some of the sweat bees. And what you want to do for the ground nesters is provide varying types of soil and vegetation in your yard. A lot of them like bare, sandy, or grassy areas. Some of them like leafy areas, but you want a combination of leafy areas and some bare areas because a lot of the native bees like to build their nests by digging, as you can see from the examples on the screen, by digging right into the soil in a bare area. Some of them will just do single nest, with just one female, all by herself. Some of them, if there's a nice habitat for them, with the sun facing just the way they like it, sometimes you'll get 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 females. They all have their own nests. They're still solitary bees, but they have a commune of nests where their little nest holes are all together in the same area. And that's success. That's a good ecosystem if you can successfully have that happen in your yard. Next. So let's talk now about bumblebees. Next. Bumblebees are a social bee, meaning they live in a colony, and they have an annual life cycle. So that nest only lasts 1 year. And if you look at where it says number 1 there on the diagram, things all start out very early in spring, and usually April, and sometimes May is when the queens come out of hibernation. They've spent most of fall and winter in hibernation in shallow little holes about 3 or 4 inches under the ground. And they crawl out in April, and they need to eat at that point because they've been sleeping for a very long time, 6 to 9 months, and they really need breakfast badly because they've depleted all of their fat stores over winter. So the first thing that queen does when she comes out of hibernation is she's going to look for nectar flowers because she needs to eat nectar. So it's very important to have those early food sources available for the queen because if she can't replenish her food sources, she's not going to have a successful nest. The first thing she has to do is make sure she's got the energy to raise her young. Then what will happen is after about a week of feeding, she is going to look for a nest site. And favorite nest sites are rodent holes are very, very popular with bumblebees, and chipmunk holes are probably the favorite. What they're looking for is a cavity that already has existing nesting material in it. So a chipmunk hole is perfect because, if the chipmunk has moved on and it's an abandoned hole, there's still going to be nest material in there. And it's a very protected environment, where the burrow where the chipmunk was nesting is usually at least a foot or more underground. And it's really a perfect place for a bumblebee to set up her housekeeping. So what she'll do is once she selects that nest site, then she's going to start provisioning it. So she's going to start visiting flowers and not only getting nectar for herself, but now she's going to get nectar and pollen so that she can raise her young. She makes little nectar pots, and in diagram number 2 there's an example of a little nectar pot. So she's going to bring that back. She stores that in a crop when she comes, in her throat when she comes, and then regurgitates it into that nectar pot. And then what you see her standing on in that diagram number 2 is a pollen bowl she's made from all the pollen that she's brought back from flowers, because that's where she's going to lay her eggs and that's where she's going to incubate her eggs. The first brood of worker bees, she's on her own. She has to do everything to raise them. So diagram number 3, about a month after she starts that process and she's laid her eggs and she's incubating them, about a month later, her first brood will have reached adulthood. They'll go through a larval, when they first hatch, they're little kind of white larvae. And then what they'll do is they spin their own cocoons and they go through complete metamorphosis. And when they come out, they are a full-size bee. They don't grow anymore after they emerge from that cocoon. But the first brood that queen raised all on her own is very often smaller than some of the successive broods, because the queen was doing it all on her own and there's more limited resources. It's also a small brood. There's usually only maybe 6 to 12 workers in that first brood. So what has to happen now is that the worker bees only live about a month. And the whole goal of a bumblebee colony is to produce the reproductive morphs. That's the new queens, which are called gynes, the ones that are going to overwinter and start the new generation in spring, and then males, so that, obviously the gynes and the males need to be mating. So what'll happen is that the colony needs first to keep producing more broods of workers so that they have enough food and enough substance in their nest to successfully raise as many gynes as they can. Because success for a bumblebee colony is all about making sure that the next generation happens in the spring. So what will happen is later in summer, like about July is when the males first start coming out as adults, and usually a little bit later, closer to August, is when the gynes primarily start emerging from the nest. When they do that, the males emerge and they leave the nest because they have to fly far enough away from the nest that they're not going to end up mating with their nest mates. So they take off, they don't return to the nest. The gynes do. The gynes will stay in the nest as long as the nest is organized and still functioning. They'll come back every night. They'll come back during the day. Some of them will bring pollen back and help provision the nest for future gynes that are being raised. But the gyne, within about 2 weeks of reaching adulthood, needs to have fed enough that she can go into hibernation and have enough fat stores in her body to survive. Hibernation is tough. There's a lot of bees that don't survive hibernation for a whole lot of reasons, weather and predation, and starvation can be one of them. If there isn't enough fat stores, the bee isn't going to survive. So it's really important that there's flowers available at every stage of this colony's life, from those early flowers that the queen needs to replenish her fat stores, to the pollen flowers that she needs very early in April and May so that she can provision her nest, and then just large populations of flowers available for the large populations of bumblebees that are out foraging later on in the summer, in July and August. And then we need flowers going into the fall time, because some of those gynes are still trying to get enough food in October. So we need flowers that are blooming September and October so that the gynes are able to build up the fat stores that they need. And we'll talk in a minute about what some of those flowers are that you can plant in your yard to support the bumblebee. Next. All right, so what do we need to do for nest and hibernation habitat needs? Nest sites and hibernation sites are as important as providing flowers. You can have all the flowers in the world, But if a queen can't find a nest site where she's going to successfully be able to raise her young, the flowers aren't going to solve the problem. So what can we all do in our yard? This is what I'm doing in my yard. And I get 10 species of bumblebees, and all of the southern bumblebees. I get the queens, and I get the workers, and I get the males in my yard. And I know that I have rusty patch bumblebees that are overwintering in my backyard because we've seen them come out with mud on that they very recently emerged from our yard. And what we've done is we leave the leaves and the vegetation to provide sheltered areas. Those guides need to dig those 3 to 4 inch holes in the ground. And for the most part, that's going to be a lot easier in a rich humus soil. They also need to have the shelter of leaves and the protection of the leaves. So leave the leaves, leave vegetation mats, sticks, rocks, and rodent holes for nest sites. About 60% of bees nest underground, bumblebees nest underground, but there are some, and some species in particular will do above ground nests, and we'll look at some examples of that in a minute. Then avoid raking, tilling, and mowing those natural areas. Just let it be natural. Don't tidy it up. Mother Nature isn't out there with a rake and a tiller, tidying up. And that's not the way bees evolved. That's not the way plants evolved. They evolved to have a very natural environment and allowing things to lay, allowing things to decompose, allowing things to be. And then finally, so important, eliminate pesticide use. Next. Here's an example of a common eastern bumblebee queen. These are new queens digging their little hibernation chamber. And Lynette Rodriguez, one of the bumblebee observers, took these photos in her yard. She had videos for us also, and it's just fascinating. But it gives you an idea. If you see these holes in your yard, you get an idea of what a hibernation hole actually looks like. So you can be careful if you're planting, if you see something like this. So what you see is that little sideways hole in the dirt. They are kicking and pushing dirt out behind them. So there's a little mound of dirt, at least initially, until erosion or whatever takes it away. And the hole itself is probably approximately 3/4 of an inch to maybe an inch in diameter. And what happens is the bee digs down 3 to 4 inches and doesn't fill in that top part. What she'll do is at the very end, instead of carrying the dirt out, she forms a dirt plug, down 3 inches, next to where she's hibernating. So you'll continue to see a hole like that if you have a hibernation hole in your yard. Next. So some of the other places that, some of the places that bumblebees like to build their nests are on top there. We have 2 rusty patch bumblebee gines coming out of a chipmunk hole. And the rusty patch gine, for those that haven't seen one, do not have a rusty patch. So what you see on the top right of the screen then is these 2 bees that have 2 big yellow abdominal sections. And what they're doing right now is what I call Bumblebee 101. They just emerged as adults from this nest, and we watched them as they did this. We watched probably 50 to 60 gines that had emerged from the nest. And what they do is they learn how to be a bee, because they were in a cocoon just probably a day before we saw them emerging from the nest. And all of a sudden they're out in this bright world. They don't know how to walk. They don't know how to fly. They don't know how to climb. So we watched them tottering and doddering all over the leaves and the sticks, learning how to do just that, getting themselves oriented before they start little practice flights where they just fly up a little bit and down and fly up a little bit and down. And then finally, when they have enough skills, they'll take off and go foraging for their first time, but then return to the nest. But when I watched that, it became so obvious to me why it's important to have sheltered areas for bees. So the rusty patch very typically is found in woody areas. And when I watched how those bees orient themselves, I thought, that's part of the survival going on, is they have the protection of those leaves and those sticks. And, if they were just out on some dirt soil, I think they would be predated pretty quickly. Whereas we saw a very successful nest in the location where this one was, in a wooded area. Then the picture on the left are some beautiful northern amber bumblebees. And they're all gines that we're looking at. So these are, again, newly emerging gines. This nest is at that stage where it's producing gines. It looks like it was a very healthy nest. Some nests don't produce any gines at all. Some nests might only produce a couple, and some, like this rusty patch nest that is pictured here, having 50 to 60 gines is just tremendously successful. I mean, not that all 50 or 60 of those gines would be successful the following year in producing a nest, but just think if half of them were, that would be 25 additional rusty patch bumblebee nests, which for an endangered species is so valuable. So when we look at this nest on the left, what we have is this was an above ground birdhouse that had old bird nesting material. So another, a lot of people have had bumblebees nest in their birdhouses because it's got that perfect combination of shelter and existing nesting material. And this one certainly looks like it was successful. It looks like there's going to be several healthy gines coming out of that nest and hopefully successfully starting a generation the following year. Next. So here's a surface level nest, and Rosetta Hahn, one of our Bumblebee Observer members, took this photo in her garden. They had used some wool mulch in their garden, and this half black bumblebee queen thought that looked like a pretty good place to build a nest. So here's one of those nests that's sort of on the surface and in vegetation, covered by grass or some sort of nesting material. I think this one was a little disturbed by something. Usually they're a little more covered than this, a little bit more vegetation on top, so they're not quite so vulnerable. Next. So native bees and bumblebees and floral needs. Let's take a look at some of the flowers. Next. The approach that we took in our yard, we had a yard that didn't have many native plants, and it had some. About 20 years ago when we moved here, it had a turf lawn in the front yard. And about 8 years ago is when we seriously started saying, well, we're gonna switch this over to a native ecosystem. And the approach that we took was to transition over time to native plants. We wanted to have at least 70% native plants in our yard. So we started by any flower that we added was a native flower. Anytime we were replacing invasives or plants that we had removed, we were replacing it with native flowers. And then we reduced our lawn size. We started out just a patch of lawn at a time. And at this point, we have our front yard is probably 70% native planting right now. So we successfully got rid of most of our turf grass in our front yard. And what we're doing now in the turf grass is we're planting some native plants in there to make that a bee lawn. It's what I would recommend to people. That if you take on too much, it can get overwhelming. So if you're just starting out, just take a patch of land, smother your grass with cardboard, and do your native planting. And if you want more information on how to smother grass, come on the Facebook page, and I'll show you that in a minute, a link to that, and we can talk more about how to smother lawn. Of course, eliminate pesticide use. We use 0 pesticides in our yard right now. And we make sure that we only buy from nurseries that are not using pesticides on plants. If you buy from, any of the big box stores, there's almost certainly neonics, which is a systemic insecticide that the plants have been treated with. And the problem with those systemic insecticides is they hang around for a few years, and you're not going to get bees, or you're not going to get healthy bees on plants that have been treated with neonics. So remove your invasive plants, replace with natives. And we're going to go through some of the recommended bumblebee flowers that you can plant in your yard that will provide blooms from April through October. And then start leaving the leaves and the stems. Skip winter and spring cleanup. Let it be natural, because natural is beautiful. Next. And why native plants? There's, sometimes people are still discussing this. People say, I see bees on non-native flowers. And you do, you definitely will see bees on non-native flowers. So why should we make a point of planting native flowers? Well, it's because native plants have formed relationships over thousands of years with pollinators, and they've learned what each other needs, and they provide what each other needs. You may see bees on, for instance, in the springtime. There was a lot of talk about, dandelions are great flowers in the springtime because they're one of the only things that bloom in early spring, and bumblebees use them. Well, I'm going to show you several flowers that bloom at the same time dandelions bloom. And unlike dandelions, they provide the right mix of nutrients and protein for bumblebees. A dandelion does not. A dandelion is actually a poor source of protein for bumblebees. But the other thing that happens with native plants is there are a lot of bees that aren't generalists like bumblebees are, where they will go to a lot of different species of flowers to forage. There are a lot of native bees, and there are a lot of butterflies that need host plants. There's several, there's all kinds of native bees that only use one genus or even one species of flower to forage. So you really want to make sure you've got diverse native plants in your yard, because pollinators really need the plants to be native. Native means that the plant grows naturally in your area without human introduction at some point. A lot of things grow wildly in yards right now that were originally introduced and became invasive. But the key is, were they naturally there, and were they never introduced by man? Next. And this is a graph that Dr. Ptolemy made to show that what he did is he looked at how many caterpillars do chickadees need in order to sustain their brood of chicks, to sustain population of chickadees in his yard. And what he found, where that little arrow was pointing, that's where the 70% came from. He found that if he had 70% natives in his yard, the chickadees could sustain their population level. Less than that, the population dwindled. Now, more than that, it might go up, but at least at 70%, the chickadees were able to sustain. So it's just kind of a bellwether to look at whether you have a healthy ecosystem. It's taking that one species of bird, and looking at what they need, but it's the sign of a healthy ecosystem. And everything is a give and a take in an ecosystem, and you want to have plants that have evolved with the insects and the animals that live there, because they've learned to give each other what they need. Next. Maybe I saw there's a few questions had come up. Should we take a minute right now and answer some questions?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Judy. All right, so pulling up the chat here quick. Can we follow up with sending links? Yes, we will absolutely send some links to not only the PowerPoint slide, but Judy has shared some additional links as well. And then anything that has been cited here, you will be able to look up online. One question is there research and or evidence that all honeybees are detrimental to native bees? And if so, to what degree and what circumstances?
There is a lot of research. There are so many studies. If you go on the Facebook page, the Bumblebee Observers Facebook page that I'll be showing you a link to, I have posted many of those studies that have been done. And the more they look at it, the more they find. There's when it comes, let's just look at disease. A fairly recent study looked at our honeybees spreading diseases to native bees. And what they looked at was the health of gynes when they went into hibernation, and then the health of them after they had been exposed to flowers that honeybees had been using once they emerged. And the scientists that did that study found a very clear link between those gynes getting, there's several different diseases that are linked to honeybees, but on them contracting those diseases once they were exposed to flowers that honeybees had been using, and the honeybees had the disease. There's also been some fairly recent studies done that have looked at, well, how well are bumblebees able to compete with honeybees? And they found even with native plantings being plentiful, that the honeybees outcompete bumblebees for resources. So it's, if like I said, why don't you go on, if you want to look at some of those studies. I probably published at least a half a dozen in the last year or so that really lay out what the problems are. Honeybees are here to stay. There's no question about that. They're agricultural livestock. They're being used and moved from field to field during pollination season, and people aren't going to give up honey. But my message is, another study that came out recently looked at the harm that was being done by people who think they're saving the bees by starting a backyard honeybee hive. And that study really looked at the fact that honeybee populations have actually been surging because people are trying to save the bees by starting their own honeybee hives. And my message is, honeybees are here to stay, but please don't start hives in your backyard thinking that you're going to be saving the bees, because actually all of the research is contrary to that.
Wow. Laura, thank you for sharing that Wisconsin Bee Identification Guide. That's perfect. Corinne asked, are bee houses a good thing to use if you don't have the ability to plant the appropriate plants?
Well, there's a couple of different kinds of bee houses. For the stem nesting bees, there's different ways you can approach it too. There's these you'll see the bee hotels, where there's like these narrow or hollowed stems or hollowed tubes that are kind of gathered together. It's not perfect. What's perfect is nature, but have some people made it work? Sure. But it's not maintenance free. The problem is when you put all those bees together and you're clustering them like that, if you have that kind of bee house, you're probably clustering them too closely, and you have to really make sure that you're cleaning and maintaining those tubes. Another approach that I've seen people use that's probably closer to nature is they'll take a log and actually drill holes in it so that they're kind of providing artificial cavities, in a natural environment, for the bees, which is probably a little closer to what they need. Nature's best. There's no question about that, but there are people who have successfully had bees nest in those little bee hotels. There are also bumblebee houses where, again, most bumblebees are underground, but some are above ground. And some people have successfully had bumblebees nest in little wood structures that they've constructed. Xerces Society has an example of one on their website if you want to try to build it. The problem is that there's not a great success rate at getting bees to use it. It's somewhere like, maybe 1 in 10, gets used, if that. But you can give it a shot.
Bee hotels, how cute. Another one was, I read that you should not do a lot of cleaning, raking, and cutting back in your garden in the fall in order to leave places for native bees to nest. Should you wait until the spring to clean up?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, they're just kind of wondering if you should wait for the spring to kind of do some cleaning, raking, and cutting back of your gardens.
All right. So my approach is it's never a good time to clean and rake your garden. And the reason that that's my approach is because that is nature's approach. No matter when you clean and rake, you are removing nesting and hibernation habitat. If you try to cut stems at any point, we went through that, why do you need to leave the stems up? It's because they are literally being used for 2 to 3 years, both for nesting and for hibernation, and they will decompose on their own. I leave in our garden areas, we leave the leaves year round, we leave the stems year round. We have some very attractive fences around our native plantings so that we contain the leaves in there and we don't have our leaves going into the street, because the city of Madison, where I live, doesn't want a lot of leaves on the street because of the runoff that occurs with lakes in the area. However, it's not hard at all for us to contain it. I think it looks attractive, but I really have come to believe natural is beautiful, and that the best thing that you can do for bees is try to change that sort of cultural pressure that we have, that you must have a clean, tidy garden, because a clean, tidy garden is not a healthy ecosystem.
A fun one. Can bumblebees recognize faces?
I absolutely believe they can. There have been a lot of studies done on bumblebee intelligence, and it is amazing what they have found. Some of you might have seen some of the results of these studies because they're spectacular. Bumblebees can be taught to play a little soccer game with a little ball by rewarding them with nectar. They can teach other bumblebees through example how to use tools. I mean, it's amazing. Some of the studies said that it changed a lot of people's whole approach to research on bumblebees, because it was no longer that, well, this is this bug, this is a dissentient intelligent being, so we're gonna do what you do in a laboratory. And a lot of the researchers said, I can't do that anymore, because I realize how intelligent they are, how they were comparing the intelligence of this tiny little bee with this tiny little seed-sized brain to chimpanzees. So there has been some studies done around honeybees as to whether they recognize faces, and the conclusion there was that they do get to know, their beekeepers. But I think the same is going to be true of honeybees, of bumblebees and other bees, because I know when I go out to my garden, I'm seeing a lot of the same bees every day, because bees only fly as far as they need to fly to find flowers. And they're not going to waste energy going further than that. So if I have flowers in my yard for bees, I'm going to see the same bees coming back every day. I'm going to see those same rusty patch bees coming back every day. And I'm out in my garden a lot. They're going to see me in my garden. So yes, they land on my shirt and I talk to them.
Oh, I love that, Judy. Anthony kind of left a comment that says, a few years ago, I tried No Mow May. In the middle of it, my tractor broke down and the area looked like amber waves of green. My wife thought I made up the No Mow May thing to get out of mowing the property, wouldn't let me do it ever again. LOL.
Yeah, and I think No Mow May has been, specifically just not mowing for the month of May has been pretty well discredited as an approach to helping the bees. The actual initial study that was done up in at Lawrence College in Appleton was actually withdrawn, as not a valid study.
Oh.
So what I think the alternative for people that want to have lawn areas, and a lot of people do, you have kids, you want to go out and be able to play in your yard, and sometimes a native planting area makes it a little hard to play badminton in your yard. What you can do are bee lawns, and and that's what I'm doing in my yard. I have lawn aisles in my between my plantings, and I wanted to do something with them where I'm providing native plants, but they can be mowed so that, City of Madison doesn't want grass areas higher than 8 inches. So I'm going to comply with that. So I came up with a whole list of plants. And if you go again on Bumblebee Observers, I recently did a post that lists out all of those native flowers and some of the sedges. And there's also a rush called path rush that you can use that will tolerate mowing, that don't grow that high, and that are healthy ecosystem plants.
Wow. The next question is, how do you encourage the bumblebees to use their yard and resources without the wasps taking over?
Well, wasps are also part of the ecosystem. I very much welcome wasps in my yard. I know that, it can be a little tough with some of the ground nesting wasps, can sometimes get very large. And in the fall time, you probably don't want them next to your front door. But most wasps that I see in my yard are solitary wasps. And just like solitary bees, they are very peaceful. I provide enough flowers for all of them. I love watching all of them. I've seen a few battles between bees when they're, pushing each other, looking for the best pollen. I have actually never seen a fight between a wasp and a bee. So wasps are pollinators. Solitary wasps are extremely gentle, as are solitary bees, as are bumblebees. So they're all very welcome in my yard.
Okay. Another question was, how do you know what plants are native to the area? And Laura ever so kindly jumped in and said there's resources with maps. You can see if a plant is native. Also, kind of purchase as closely as you can to where you live. If you purchase locally, you have the added benefit of being able to ask questions more specific to your needs. Laura shared a nice resource for Wisconsin, the Native Plants Prairie Nursery, and then you can also search the USDA plant database. There's another comment just here that says those native bees that require a host plant to survive definitely are impacted by climate change, since this is a significant effect on the phenology of this host relationship. When it comes by a week or two, both bee and flower are in peril. Or when it changes by a week or two, both bee and flower are in peril.
Absolutely.
Trisha?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Climate change. I'm sorry.
Nope. I thought you guys were finished. Finish with that one.
Climate change is having just a terribly significant impact on all pollinators. But I think the comment about those that need host plants is just spot on, because these insects and flowers that have evolved together have a phenology that matches each other, so that, the flower's there when the bee comes out and needs it, to feed her young, and she's there to pollinate the flower when the flower needs her to pollinate. And if it's off by a few weeks and a bee emerges and is trying to forage for food and can't find the flower, you could have, we could and have had, there are so many native bee species, I don't think we even come close to having a good handle on which of those native solitary bees are endangered at this point. But we probably have already lost native species that are specialists, plant specialists.
So, Patricia, you missed one question. Should I be concerned if a neighbor about a half a mile away has honeybee hives? I have rusty patched bumblebees and am willing to talk to the neighbor.
Well, it's kind of a reality that we all live with, because most cities, I know the city of Madison, you can have honeybee hives in your backyard. I don't know how happy a neighbor is going to be to hear this, but if you have a honeybee hive in your backyard, for every colony of bees you have in your backyard, honeybees, you should be providing 1 to 5 acres of pollinator flowers, not expecting neighbors to provide flowers for the bees in your backyard. There's studies, that, and again, a recent study you can find on Bumblebee Observers that talks about that. It's a very sensitive subject for people that have honeybees. They love their honeybees, but it's just like native. It's like native plants. For people that understand why we should have native plants, then you also need to understand why we should have native insects. And the honeybee is not a native insect, and it doesn't belong in native habitats. From a disease perspective, does having honeybees close by, a honeybee will forage further than a bumblebee, and they will go like up to a mile when they're looking for food. Not again, they'll go only as far as they need to go. But if you've got a fairly close neighbor and you've got flowers in your yard, you're probably going to have their honeybees in your yard. I know I have other people's honeybees in my yard. And can they spread disease? Yes, they can. They do. The studies have demonstrated it. So if you could have a civil conversation with a neighbor about it, if you think there's any chance of changing their mind, you can give it a shot.
Yeah. We'll do this last question from Sam, and then we'll jump back into your presentation, Judy, and I'll pick back up at the end with all the remaining questions that we haven't addressed yet, just so that we can keep moving.
Sure.
But this last question is, what are your thoughts about controlled burns? Just thinking about the wildfires in California and the fact that they didn't do a whole lot of them and it caused this big issue. What is that balance with the bees?
Well, here's what I think about controlled burns. Obviously, burns are part of a natural ecosystem. There were burns. Were there burns every year? No. Were there burns every other year? Probably not. So it's a question of how the burn is done as to how it's going to affect bumblebees. And there's studies that have been done. There's one being done right now at the University of Wisconsin on controlled burns and bumblebees. And they're looking specifically at the impact on nesting bumblebees in addition to foraging bumblebees. What they find is that overall, having some level of burning produces more flowers, and from a foraging perspective is positive to the bees. I've done a lot of reading on this because you can also see there's certainly some downsides to burns too. And where I think it's at is that burns need to be done in rotation. They absolutely should not be done every year. If you see a prairie that's all grass, you probably have someone who's doing an annual burn, maybe because they get funding to do an annual burn and they don't want to not do it because they're going to lose the funding. But you'll see this not healthy diversity in an overburned area. But I think the best approach is, first, you have to leave refugia for bees. You can't burn a whole area. You have to leave part of it unburned. So there is a place for bees to go. There's a place for them to nest. There's a place, where the flowers are at a different stage of growing than where the burn happened. And probably being on a multi-year cycle there, probably somewhere in 3 to 5 year range, where the burns are being done on, every 3 to 5 years on a section of the land, while other parts of the land are being left unburned and available for bees, is probably the best approach. I very much look forward to the results of the study that it hasn't been published yet, but were just done at the University of Wisconsin regarding burns.
Awesome. All right. Well, Judy, we'll keep going through with your presentation. For everyone whose questions weren't addressed yet, we will come back to you at the end. So just hang on, and if kind of thoughts come to mind throughout the remainder of this presentation, please adding them to the chat, and we will get those all answered at the end.
Okay, the next slide here, I put a couple of examples of, even though bumblebees are generalist pollinators, they go on a wide variety of flowers, there's very much symbiotic relationships that exist, that are evolutionary relationships between bumblebees and native flowers. And this series of pictures from my yard gives one of the good examples of this. This is a late blooming bottle gentian. Bottle gentian grow in that, I call it gyne time, late in the summer, August, September, October, when those gynes need to be able to feed as quickly as they can, as much as they can, so that they can be ready for hibernation and have enough fat stores. So if you look at that flower, the bottle gentian, that is a mature, open, so to speak, flower. It never opens. That's why it's called bottle gentian. So most pollinators, they cannot get into that flower and access the nectar or the pollen or conduct pollination for the flower. But you see that bumblebee doesn't have any problems. It's kind of fun to watch because they literally pry it open. They're big and strong and they're able to do it, and they pull it apart. And the final shot, you have success there with just a bee butt sticking out of the gentian. What the next shot would have been if I had included it is that bee will be completely enveloped by the gentian and moving around in there, picking up all that pollen, moving on to the next flower, pollinating the gentian, and getting a boatload of pollen for themselves and their nest. And it's almost exclusively pollinated. The bottle gentians are almost exclusively pollinated by bumblebees. Next. And here's another beautiful evolutionary symbiotic relationship. Shooting star, now we're on the other end of the season, is the spring flower. And it's a flower that gets used by a lot of queens and also by some of the workers that are trying to gather food. But it's a nice queen flower. And what happens with shooting star is it's not a nectar producer, it's a pollen producer. And if you look at how those anthers are hanging down there, in order to get to the anthers, you need to do what that lady's doing right there on that bee. She's grabbing the anther. She's actually going to reach up. She hasn't done it yet, but she's going to reach up with her mouth, with her mandibles, and she's going to grab onto the base of those anthers. She's going to hang on with her feet, and then she's going to vibrate her wing muscles very strongly, which is why it's caused buzz pollination, because as we were watching this, we could hear the buzz going on. And you can actually see it starting there. If you see that blur right above her belly, when she vibrates, that causes that pollen to release down onto her belly. And bumblebees are very uniquely adapted to gathering pollen all over their body. That's why they're the best pollinators. So she gathers that pollen on her abdomen. And then what she has is little combs on her legs, and she's going to comb that off of her body, off of her abdomen, and you can see where she's already started. If you look at that, there's a little pollen ball on her hind leg. That's her curbicula, where she carries the pollen back to her nest. In there, she's gonna use those combs. She's gonna groom that pollen down, and she's gonna pack it with a little nectar into her curbicula. So a very special relationship. Again, the bumblebee is one of only 2 bees that pollinates shooting stars. So in this case, you have a plant that is very dependent upon bumblebees. And while the bumblebee isn't totally dependent on shooting star because it's a generalist, it very much, during shooting star season, you'll see bumblebees all over it gathering pollen. Next. And this gives you an idea of how far pollinators typically go to find their flowers. And if you look at that little rusty patch line there, the second line down, 900 to 1,800 feet. That's how far, if you want to have a successful nest where bees aren't wasting all of their energy flying and looking for flowers, that's only how far they're going to go. So that's your neighborhood. That's you and your neighbors and maybe the neighbors next to them. You need a little corridor where they're able to get enough flowers so that they can support the nest. And an interesting thing about bees is once they do trap line. There's a study that came out recently. They do trap line foraging. When they find good flowers, they don't, not unlike a honeybee who will just kind of fly all over the place looking for flowers, and there isn't a real systematic approach there. What happens with a a bumblebee is that once they find their flowers, they come back. That's why I know that bumblebees know who I am, because I know who they are, because I see the same bees in my flowers every day because I'm on their trap line. Next. Okay, with every flower we plant, we can make a difference. All of these photos are of rusty patch bumblebees. We get a lot of rusty patch in my yard because we plant a lot of flowers that they need. And I'm going to point out again that rusty patch queen, if you haven't seen one, first of all, she's huge. She's over twice as big as the worker is, but there's no rusty patch on her. She's just a beautiful bee. But we have a fall gyn on showy goldenrod. We have a spring queen down in the bottom right corner on Dutchman's breeches, which is one of the best rusty patch bumblebee spring flowers. And then we have a summertime, a July rusty patch worker on Virginia Mountain in the top right. Next. The phenology of bees. What do they need for survival? When that queen emerges from hibernation, she needs to have flowers available and she needs to have nest habitat available. Both are important. Next. Here are some, I'm not going to read them all off for you, but here are some of those early flowers that instead of letting dandelions grow in your turf lawn, plant some of these. Plant them in, these are wooded area plants, but you can create your own wooded area under the drip line of a tree. And spring ephemerals and spring woodland flowers are really very, very important to bumblebees, as are some of the very early blooming shrubs and thickets like American plum and pussy willow and currants and gooseberries. And there's also some of the early maple trees are also very important to the early bees. But these three flowers that you see there, the Dutchman's breeches, the Virginia bluebells, and then down in the bottom right corner, the Virginia waterleaf, are, I think, three of the most important woodland flowers for bumblebees. Next. Now, when we get to June and August, that's when the population really starts picking up. That's when the workers need to go out and forage and have lots of floral resources available so they can all have successful nests. This is when the peak population occurs, while all those workers are trying to raise the reproductive morphs. That's the mission of all of the colonies. So what you need in June through August are a large number of diverse flowers, and we'll take a look at a few of those next. There's a list there of some of there's a lot of flowers. I mean, at the very end of this section, we're going to have a much more extensive list, but just here are some of the good examples of some of the summer flowers. What you have pictured there are some rusty patch workers. The first one on Culver's fruit, who's got a little photobomber solitary bee friend coming in too for some foraging. And then on the right-hand side, that's a rusty patch worker on wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa, another really important bumblebee flower. I listed some other flowers there that are all good for bees. And next. September through October, what do we need then? Well, we need to have those late blooming flowers for those gynes. If they don't have flowers available then so that they can feed and store fat, they're not going to survive winter. And they also need to have those hibernation areas, those natural leafy areas where they can dig their hibernation chambers. Next. And here's some examples of some of those late blooming flowers. Again, these are all rusty patch gynes. The first one is on beautiful obedient plant, that pink flower on the far left. And in the middle, we have showy goldenrod, which is a great gyne flower that blooms normally in September. And then one of the later blooming flowers on the far right is New England aster, that some of the asters can bloom into October and even November. And then there's a list of some more plants that are later bloomers there. Next. So I guess remember that every gyne that can't find blooming flowers in a hibernation site, and every spring queen that can't find a nest site and early flowers to feed, means the loss of that bumblebee line. Those queens and gynes it's what a bumblebee colony is all about, and it's what saving the bees is all about. Next. I'm not going to go through this, but again, you have access to this. This is a much more comprehensive list of some of the flowers that are very important for bees. And what I did is I put an asterisk next to the ones that are particularly important to support the rusty patch bumblebee. Next. Here's a link to a really nice publication that the DNR has on the Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade page. If you want to scan that URL code, you can get a copy of this yourself. I find it very helpful. Next. I guess we'll hold off for questions till we get to the end, so we'll move on from this slide. Community science is another really important way to make a difference. Next. So the Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade is the DNR's community science program for bumblebees. It's as simple as when you see a bee in your yard or you see a bee when you're taking a walk somewhere, take a photograph of it and submit it to this website. That the URL code is there that you can scan. The DNR uses this information heavily to determine what's going on with populations of bees in the state, whether any other bees are getting into trouble. This is how we track what's going on with the rusty patch bumblebee, and it's how we help landowners manage their land. Next. This is just another, this is how you actually learn about how to enter your photos. Next. And then here, I highly recommend this. I think the people that love bees that are on this site are so happy to have it because it's a nice community of people that really care about providing habitat for bees, that care about bees, and everybody helps each other throughout the season, kind of learning what to do and what's best for bumblebees and native bees. And it's just a Facebook page, Wisconsin Midwest Bumblebee Observers. Next. Let's do some ID. Let's see how much we can get done here. Okay, we'll start on the first page. Next. These are the 20 bumblebee species in Wisconsin. This is a field guide that's available on the Bumblebee Brigade page. There are two bees that are two cuckoo bees that have not been seen for decades, but the rest of these bees are all around, and it will probably have a 21st bee added to our species list this year. That's the Southern Plains bumblebee, which is actually a very threatened bumblebee. But what seems to be happening is it seems to be moving north because of climate change. So where Wisconsin did not used to have Southern Plains, now we've had multiple sightings for the last 2 years throughout Wisconsin, the southern part of Wisconsin. Next. Okay, so most of the bumblebees that you see in the summertime are the female workers. The populations peak in July for the workers, and then the males start flying in July. So in August, you see a lot of males also. The males you see sleeping in the flowers because they've been booted out of the nest and they're out looking for mates. 6 species of bumblebees account for about 75% of the bees reported. So we're going to try to get through some of those 6 species and teach you how to identify a bee. I think it's easier than you might think. Next. This just shows a graph showing you how much the population increases in the summer. Next. Here are those 6 species, and we'll take a look at them. Next. Next. This is the bumblebee guide that you can look at all 20 of the species on this guide, and that URL code will take it to you. These are photo ID cards that give you all the key traits so you can carry it with you and identify in the field with it. Next. Next.
Judy, are you able to see the 4 key ID characteristics slide?
Judy, I think you're muted.
There we go. I don't know why I got booted out, but I'm back. So when you're trying to identify a bee, you're going to look at, if you look at the top of that diagram, you're going to look at the face, the very front of the bee's face. What color is it? You're going to look at the vertex. What is the top of the bee's head color? Then you're going to look at the thorax patch. What's going on between the wing pads? What color is the thorax patch? How large is it? What size is it? And then you're going to look at the abdominal sections and what the color pattern is. So we're going to run out of time here. So I'm just going to look at 2 of these bees. We're going to look first at the most common bee, which is next. Next.
Can you see the male rusty patched bee?
I'm not sure what's happening, but my screen is not progressing.
Uh-oh.
I'm still seeing the 4 key ID characteristics page.
To read off.
So we're
That's
not
what we
going to go through this, but this just tells some of the differences between males and females. So let's click to the next. I'm still seeing, okay, let's click to the next. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so what we're looking at here is, oh, just stay here. That's fine. Stay here.
Okay.
So on a common eastern bumblebee, what you're going to look for is the shape of that thorax patch right between on the top of her back there, between those wing bases. You see that very large keyhole shaped thorax patch. That's a key ID trait of a common eastern bumblebee. And the other key ID trait is, if you look at her abdomen, only the first abdominal section is yellow. All the rest are black. That's the only bee that only has the first section yellow. So that's it. You know how to identify the most common bumblebee in Wisconsin. Next. Here's a male. And the difference with males is they almost always have yellow on their face. And if you look at this little male common eastern, you can see he's got a yellow mustache. He's got more yellow hair all over his body. He does not have a place to carry pollen back to the nest, because male bumblebees don't carry pollen back to the nest. Their role is to breed, not to provision the nest. And they also have 7 abdominal sections and no stinger point, unlike a female. And then let's skip to the very last bee here, which is the rusty patch bumblebee. And I'm sorry we got started late and we weren't able to cover all of these. It's my favorite part. But all of these bees and the key ID traits are available in that photo guide that I showed you, the URL code. Okay, next. So this is the rusty patch bumblebee worker. You can see she's got some pollen in her corbicula. And the key ID trait that we can see from this side view is, if you look at that second abdominal section, it's numbered 8 on the slide. You see that little rusty patch that's right in the middle of that second abdominal section. There is yellow underneath the rusty patch. And that's how you tell it the difference from another bee, the brown belted bee, that looks somewhat similar. The brown belted has black under its brown patch. The rusty patch has yellow. Next. And here we see the 2 key traits that are going to tell you have a rusty patch bumblebee. They have a thumbtack shaped thorax patch on their back. So if you look between her wings, you see that, the top of the thumbtack goes from wing pad to wing pad, and then the point of the thumbtack goes down. And then if you look on that second abdominal section, you see that rusty patch that's bordered by yellow. Next. And the male, same thing. There's that we talked about on the male common eastern, more yellow in the vertex, and 7 abdominal sections. Next. That's it. We can take a few minutes for some more questions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, for those that are able to stick around, please do. If you have to hop off, we will be sharing out the presentation slides with you, the video, some of those additional resources too. I'll also share Judy's email. She's comfortable receiving questions from you guys. So if we don't get to all of the questions, you can always reach out to her yourself and get those answered. So we left off with Sam about the thoughts on controlled burns. Anthony shared, if you want to learn fascinating facts about all bees, read The Mind of Bees by Lars Chitka, I hope.
Yes.
Okay.
I've met Lars. He is just absolutely fascinating. And he did a lot of, I think it's William and Mary University in London. That's where a lot of that research on bumblebee sentience occurred. And I think Lars opened a lot of people's eyes about just how intelligent the bumblebee is.
Awesome. Dave said best native plant nursery directories in 2024. And he then shared the picture with a bunch of different ones. Corinne said Wild Ones Native Plant Organization has chapters in Wisconsin. Local Fox Valley chapter is having an educational conference February 8th in Neenah.
It's an excellent organization.
Yeah. Laura also said that Wild Ones is a great resource for native plants. See, another comment is our native wasps/hornets are very beneficial to the ecosystem. It is invasive wasps/hornets like the yellow-legged hornet and the giant Asian hornet that are threatening entry into North America. They will be, with 2 E's, detrimental to our local species.
Well, I think it is true that we have a couple of non-native wasps, and those are some of the more aggressive ones. There's a non-native yellow jacket. There's also a native yellow jacket, but there's a non-native yellow jacket that is not very popular with people. And then there's also a non-native paper wasp that there's quite a few of them around.
There's also a comment about checking out the Washington Native Bee Society. If you're enamored with bumblebees, they do free monthly Zoom meetings. And it's also nice to learn more about bumblebees, and they deliver. A question is, are there any vegetable plants bumblebees are attracted to?
Oh, yes. There's actually, got to mention the squash bee, because there are native squashes, and there's actually a native bee, a squash bee that lives by squash. And if you grow many pumpkins or squash, you've probably seen squash bees in them. But while tomatoes self-pollinate, the bee that is used to pollinate them when something's being done in a greenhouse is a bumblebee, because if you look at the way that a tomato flower is designed, it's one of those hanging anthers, and it benefits from buzz pollination. There are many other of those types of crops: cranberries, blueberries, let's see what else, peppers, eggplant. There's a lot of vegetables that if you look at the formation of the flower, it's the hanging anthers. And bumblebees really are the best pollinator because their body is completely designed for it. And if you have a flower that is suited to buzz pollination, honeybees they are not capable. They can't buzz pollinate. So if you've got hanging anthers and something suited to buzz pollination, the bumblebee is going to be the best bee to pollinate it.
There's another comment, is that honeybees return to the same flowers to forage. It is called floral fidelity. It is supported by foragers returning to the hive and perform the waggle dance for other hive bees.
Right. Well, they even perform the wiggle dance outside of the hive, and bumblebees do not do that. what bumblebees do is they go into the hive after they've successfully found some flowers, and they do this excited walk, and it gets everybody else excited, and it gets anybody who's been lazing around the nest to go back out and to find flowers. But they do the trap line, versus what, the honeybees show each other where to go to flowers. The bumblebees find their own trap line. So that's kind of the difference in how they forage.
I think when you say the wiggle waggle dance, I'm just imagining their little butts moving back and forth. I don't know
Oh,
if
they
that's
do. Yeah, they actually,
the image that comes to mind.
it's a way of communicating for honeybees.
Cute. One comment is a comment and question. We have a lot of deer that come through our yard and like to graze through my gardens. Do you have suggestions for bee safe deterrent? I used deer scram, which is supposed to be all natural.
I get very nervous when I hear the word repellent used in any way. And I know that deer are a huge problem. When it comes to actual garden plants, it's one situation. I would recommend, if you're trying to plant natives, that I know that we had just talked about about Prairie Nursery. That's a wonderful native plant nursery right here in Wisconsin. They actually have a section on their website for deer-resistant native plants. So there are native flowers that you can plant that deer don't like, and they give a good listing of what those are. What I don't know enough about deer repellent to give an answer and say this one's safe, this one isn't. I would just be very cautious on using something to make very sure that you don't have something that's going to cause harm. And that means researching yourself, what it is you're trying to use.
Yeah. Someone just said, thank you so much for maintaining the Facebook page. Couple thumbs up and hearts with that. Next question is, can you talk at all about the use of bumblebees for greenhouse pollination? Their breeding, positive and negative issues, especially if they leave the greenhouse with visible diseases.
Right. Well, like any colony, any managed colony can be a disease source. So whether that's honeybees or whether that's bumblebees, if you have managed bees that are being kept in colony boxes, you're going to have more disease there. They actually think the disease that caused the most harm to the rusty patch bumblebee came from common eastern bumblebees that were bred in colonies in Europe, picked up a disease, and were brought back to do exactly what the questioner was describing, to do hothouse pollination of vegetables like tomatoes and peppers. And the problem is exactly that, is that if it's a managed colony, it's more susceptible to disease. And if they escape the hothouse, they can spread disease. It's not quite the same if they're actually being, it's a little easier to manage a managed colony of native bees if they're kept in a greenhouse. However, there are people right now that are using common eastern bumblebees, managed colonies, to pollinate things like blueberries and cranberries. And it's very hard if you're going to bring in a colony of bees that are just out on a field pollinating. You're not going to contain them, so yes, there is going to be disease spread because of that. And the last thing that you want to have happen is to have somebody say, well, they're native bees, we'll just let them stay here. The world doesn't need more common eastern bumblebees from managed colonies. That's not where the problem is. The problem is with those native bees that aren't in managed colonies that are much more vulnerable than the common eastern bumblebee.
Another question is, so the increase to 21 bumblebee species, Southern Plains, is it the result of climate change where the species is moving north because of warmer temperatures?
That's my theory. Something like that needs to be thoroughly researched, but it certainly seems to make sense, because what's happened is it's moved northward. It's moved northward into Minnesota. It's moved northward into Wisconsin. There have been other populations of bumblebees out west where that kind of movement has been documented, and they believe that was probably a climate change caused, movement. So when we're starting to see threatened bumblebees that may be classified as an endangered species in the not too distant future showing up in Wisconsin for the first time after never having any records for all those years, something is making them move northward. And it would certainly make sense if that was the change in temperature that climate change is causing.
Yeah. We're almost to the bottom here. So comment on you should do a separate YouTube presentation just on how to identify Wisconsin bumblebees. I think it would be great and very helpful for us citizen scientists. So something to think about, Judy. Everyone's looking for more information.
So just to mention, those do exist right now. If you go on the Bumblebee Brigade website, I've done with some other folks at the DNR several ID sessions that are recorded and that you can watch if you'd like to watch. But I'm always open to do just a bumblebee ID. It is my favorite thing to talk about.
As someone else recommended, another good book to add to everyone's book list is The Our Native Bees by Paige Embry. And then let's see, I think there's one last question. Marigolds are often suggested as a companion plant in vegetable gardens to deter pests. Is there any data on the effect of marigolds on native bees?
I guess that I mean, I've heard the same thing, where people say the smell, deters and all that. The marigold is a non-native flower. A lot of marigolds have been cultivated in a way that they've got double blooms, which mean they don't have particularly good pollen access. Whenever a cultivar has no, you see a bunch of petals instead of an area for anthers and pollen, that's not going to be a good pollen flower. So some marigolds still have, sources of pollen, some don't. I haven't seen any studies on it. It's not something I'm researching or encouraging, because what I'm encouraging people to do is to plant natives.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, those are all the questions we received. Someone left us with the cutest tiny little bumblebee poem on there to kind of end on a very sweet note. So Laura, we got great presentation, Judy, learned a lot. One last question. We'll do this. And then Laura, do you want me to pass it back off to you to kind of do the final wrap up?
As far as anything else to say.
Okay. Well, then this last question is, how strict do we need to be with native plants? I allow some that are just a state away.
I definitely understand that approach, because and a lot of the native plant people are it's climate change is going on, and that's what people are thinking about is, where are we going to be in 10 years and 20 years? Just like that Southern Plains bumblebee, we think is moving north because the ecosystem has changed for them and temperatures are such they're moving north. That's the thought of some people, is that some of those, if a plant is native in northern Illinois and you live a county away in southern Wisconsin, there's a couple of ways of determining whether a plant is native or not. There's these BONAP maps that seem to be based on whether botanists historically have found records, over the many years of botanists, going out and looking for flowers in a state. And then there's also this sort of ecoregion approach, which is probably a better way to look at it. And ecoregions cross state lines because in reality, they do cross state lines. So I think that if you're doing a prairie restoration, you're going to want to just do native plants. If you want to restore to where it was. You're going to want to use the plants that are native to the area. If you're in your yard and you want to have 70% native plants and you want to plant some plants that, are not too far south of you, I don't think that's a bad thing.
Okay. Awesome. Well, with that, we will wrap up our webinar. Judy, thank you so much for jumping on and for leading this presentation. And Friends of North Point, thank you guys for finding Judy. This was a wonderful expert to share to talk about our how to help our Wisconsin's threatened bumblebees, and everyone that joined. Thank you all so much for hanging in at the very beginning and staying to learn all of this wealth of knowledge that Judy has to share. Like I said, and like Laura shared a couple times in the chat, we will send out the recording, the PowerPoint presentation slides, and then a couple other resources that Judy has to share along with her email, so you guys can keep educating yourself on our bumblebees. But with that, thank you all for joining.
And I would like to thank everyone and apologize for the technical glitches at the beginning. And I'm so glad we had a chance to talk.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judy. I look forward to seeing you on the Bumblebee page.
All right. See everybody there.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
So, Patricia, are you hanging out for a few minutes, or do we need to hang out, or are we good to go?
It is up to you, Laura. Do we have anything we want to talk about? Otherwise, we can log off for the night.
Yeah, I can't think of anything. I think it went well, and yeah. So,
This is
and thank
wonderful.
you
Yeah.
for everything that you did.
Absolutely. Thank you for finding Judy. This was amazing. I'm excited to share this out with everyone, and I'll put this recording and the information on the Friends of North Point webpage as well. So
Yes, excellent. And would we be able to share that then on Facebook again, oh, I know. I wanted to ask you, do you guys have a YouTube channel? Does
yes,
LNRP have yeah.
we will add this to our YouTube channel as well. Let me write this all down, actually.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, then enjoy your night, Laura, and we will talk soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.